The Story of Ham Radio, a narrative journey through time. Imagine a teenager in the late 1800s sitting in a dusty attic surrounded by wires, spark coils, and crude diagrams, nervously tapping out a message through the ether. What starts as a hobby transforms into a global phenomenon uniting strangers, saving lives, and even exploring space. This is the incredible story of Ham Radio, where curious minds changed the world one transmission at a time. The story begins with the dreamers of the 19th century. Scientists like James Clerk Maxwell theorized the existence of electromagnetic waves, and Heinrich Hertz proved they were real. But it was Guglielmo Marconi who turned theory into practice, creating the first wireless communication system in 1896. By 1901, Marconi had transmitted a signal across the Atlantic, a feat that captured imaginations worldwide. Although Marconi became a commercial titan, he remained an experimenter at heart. Some even call him the world's first ham. Across the Atlantic, inspired tinkerers began building their own crude radios, often from scavenged parts like spark coils and baling wire. It was a chaotic time with no rules, no licenses, and no limits. These early pioneers didn't just send messages, they opened the door to the future. In the early 1900s, amateur radio was dismissed as a hobby for eccentrics, but one man changed everything. Hiram Percy Maxim. An inventor and a ham Maxim realized that amateurs could be more than isolated tinkerers. In 1914, he founded the American Radio Relay League, organizing operators into a network to relay messages over vast distances. Maxim's vision wasn't just technical, it was social. By connecting people, amateur radio became a community that transcended borders. World War I was a turning point for amateur radio. In 1917, the U.S. government shut down all amateur transmissions, fearing they could interfere with military operations. But instead of sidelining hams, the war elevated them. Thousands of amateur operators were recruited to serve as military radio operators, proving their value in critical communication roles. After the war, amateur radio returned, but not without a fight. The U.S. Navy wanted to maintain control over the airwaves. It took relentless lobbying by the ARRL and a resolution from Congress to reopen the bans to hams in 1919. It was a hard-fought victory, one that solidified the collective power of the amateur radio community. The 1920s were a golden age for amateur radio. Technological advances like vacuum tubes replaced spark gap transmitters, creating more efficient and reliable radios. Hams were no longer limited to local communication, they began pushing the boundaries of global connection. In 1923, French operator Leon Deloy achieved the first transatlantic contact with American hams Fred Schnell and John Reinhardt. These achievements inspired the creation of the International Amateur Radio Union in 1925, fostering global collaboration among hams. By the end of the decade, amateur operators were no longer seen as hobbyists, but as innovators. They had proven that shortwave frequencies, once considered useless, were in fact the key to long-distance communication. As the world plunged into World War II, amateur radio went silent. Once again. In 1941, all amateur operations were suspended, but this time, hams were ready. Thousands enlisted as radio operators or joined the War Emergency Radio Service, providing critical communication during air raids and blackouts. The war also introduced hams to new technology like radar and high-frequency direction finding, which they would later adapt for civilian use. When the war ended, surplus military equipment flooded the market, giving hams the tools to rebuild and innovate. The post-war years were a time of exploration. In 1961, amateur satellites like Oscar began orbiting the Earth, enabling global communication like never before. By the late 60s, hams were bouncing signals off the moon, creating Earth-Moon-Earth communication, a feat unimaginable just decades earlier. Then in 1983, amateur radio truly left the Earth. Astronaut Owen Garriott made history by operating ham radio from the Space Shuttle Columbia, chatting with operators around the world. It was a moment of triumph, demonstrating that ham radio wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a gateway to the future. The 1980s and 90s brought new challenges and opportunities. Digital modes like packet radio and PSK-31 transformed ham radio, merging it with personal computers. Suddenly, hams could send error-free text messages across the globe, using minimal bandwidth. The rise of the Internet posed another challenge. Why use radios to talk across the world when you could just email? But instead of fading, ham radio adapted. New technologies like software-defined radios and systems like Echolink bridged traditional radio with digital networks, keeping the hobby relevant and accessible. Today, amateur radio is as diverse as the people who use it. From disaster relief to space exploration, hams continue to play a vital role in communication. They are experimenters, educators, and community builders united by a shared passion for discovery. Amateur radio's history isn't just about technology, it's about people. It's the story of dreamers who refused to accept limits, of communities that came together to solve problems, and of a hobby that became a global force for good. What started with sparks and wires in a dusty attic grew into a network that spans the globe and beyond. The next chapter of amateur radio is still being written. Are you ready to tune in? What did you think of this amazing story about ham radio? If you loved it, don't you dare hit that like button. Seriously, don't. Because if you do, you might start enjoying more ham radio content, and who has time for fun hobbies these days? And whatever you do, absolutely don't subscribe. I mean, do you really need more fascinating stories, tech tips, and historical gems showing up in your feed? That sounds way too enjoyable. And don't even think about sharing this video with your friends. They might become hams too, and then we'd have even more people to talk to on the airwaves. What a nightmare. Let's just keep this our little secret, okay? 73 and happy DXing.